Varg Vikernes is a Norwegian musician known as the person behind the one-man band Burzum. Throughout the years, Burzum has received critical acclaim and managed to develop an international fanbase. However, Varg will always be better known for his controversies outside of music. During the early days of black metal, he started a series of church burnings that enveloped all of Scandinavia. His actions indirectly resulted in a fellow musician's murder of a complete stranger, and his reign of terror was ended by his murder of Euronymous, the man who started the Norwegian black metal scene. But despite these atrocities and the dangerous worldview he developed throughout his life, Varg has managed to form a large cult of influence. His actions and beliefs seem to perpetually shape the Norwegian metal scene, and he has consistently dominated the media cycle, both during black metal's early years and during his time in prison. So, how does he do it? How has Varg been able to successfully shape the identity of both his music scene and his country so consistently for decades? Which conscious decisions or natural predispositions have led to Varg becoming the face of several movements? Let's dive into Varg Vikernes' cult of personality. Kristian Vikernes was born on the 11th of February 1973 in Bergen, Norway. Kristian was a joyous child who struggled to adjust to other people. As a result, he was excluded from sports, group play or school social groups, spending most of his time playing by himself. Even as a child, he would have constant conflict with his father, who had strict, authoritarian views about how things should be done. His ideology in his youth was mostly about opposition, adopting the polar opposite of the ruling opinion. Naturally, this made him disagreeable to most of his peers. His alienation was only strengthened when he and his family moved to Iraq. Kristian's father was an engineer tasked with developing software for the Iraqi government in 1979, as Saddam Hussein was trying to modernize the country. He predominantly hired Europeans to do so, which included Kristian's father, and the whole family ended up moving to Baghdad together when Kristian was 6 years old. Upon their arrival, they found that the English language school was already full, and Kristian was enrolled in a standard Iraqi school. This obviously meant that the gap between him and other children widened drastically. It's hard to make friends when you come from a completely different culture and don't even speak your peers' language. In fact, Kristian did not even speak English, making it impossible for him to communicate with anyone except his immediate family. The Vikernes family's social status only enhanced this gap. Kristian lived in a large house with a garden and palm trees. Around 100 meters away, he could see his peers living in extreme poverty, an entire district of what he describes as mud huts. In addition to that, Europeans were treated significantly better than his Iraqi peers. Middle Eastern students were treated very strictly by the teachers, even being beaten regularly. In contrast, Kristian could get away with a lot without any repercussions from the school. He started challenging authority outside of his family. At one point, his mother recalls Kristian calling his teacher a monkey, learning a few English words specifically to do so. Other than his parents being called to the school, Kristian did not face any punishment for his trespass. His experience in Iraq is something he frequently cites as the start of the extreme beliefs he developed later in life. Upon his return to Norway, Kristian was significantly behind socially compared to his peers. His extended isolation left him in a state of perpetual conflict. He would taunt and threaten other students, even getting into regular fights. He was forced to change schools due to his constant fighting in 8th grade, which led to him making the decision to stop going to school altogether. He cut all outside contact and was left without any friends. Christian had no choice but to develop a very imaginative mind, which he found a creative outlet for in tabletop RPGs. He spent all of his time scouring through RPG rulebooks and working on his own campaigns. The relationships he formed at the local game shop led to the formation of his first real friend group, a group of older teens he played role-playing games with regularly. The group only accelerated his antisocial tendencies. As they were older, they had legal access to firearms. Christian would have them purchase a rifle and a shotgun for him, and he joined a local rifle club for access to ammunition. Technically, you were only allowed to use the purchased ammunition inside the range, but Christian would pocket extra ammunition and practice shooting in the woods. He fantasized about an all-out societal war and stockpiled weaponry for the upcoming societal collapse. He saw war as the only way of destroying the old and building a new society from scratch. The nature of the war was, again, influenced by his RPG group, whose focus lied on magic and the occult. Christian would borrow their books on occultism, and soon developed a fascination for it. He committed himself to an archaic, medieval form of Satanism, in which Satan is treated as a real biblical entity waging an eternal war with God. Unlike modern Levian Satanism, which sees Satan as merely a symbol for nature, Vikernes' Satanism matches Christianity's interpretation of him. Christian doctrine is treated as a semi-factual account of Satan, with Vikernes simply choosing to align himself with the evil side of the war between good and evil. Again, his contrarian outlook shines true. However, his RPG days would soon come to an end. His older friends all went off to university, and the group quickly fell apart. Christian needed to find something else to focus on, so he fully dedicated himself to music. He would end up joining the band Old Funeral at 17 as a guitarist. He played with them for 2 years, but he often clashed with them, causing him to leave soon after. Their musical style boiled down to the commercial death metal he hated, and their interests didn't extend past the rockstar lifestyle of constant partying. He found their disinterest in occultism and anti-establishment rhetoric disappointing, and needed a way to voice those beliefs out into the world. This would exhibit itself in the creation of the one-man band, Burzum. Burzum is one of the words making up the inscription on the One Ring, meaning darkness in the language Tolkien invented for his novels. He adopted an alias when performing, Count GRISHNACKH, based on one of the orcs in Tolkien's series. A lot of Burzum's early music has heavy satanic themes. According to Christian, he didn't fully know what he wanted Burzum to be when he started the band. Building upon his growing knowledge of the occult, he translated his current religion into his music. This change in ideology was accompanied by a change in name. In 1991, Christian Vikernes would start going by Varg, Norwegian for wolf. So, a few years after its inception, with a new name and a new band, Varg entered black metal and quickly changed its aesthetics completely. Black metal is largely known for its Satanism, but that isn't what the genre initially entailed. During the first few years of its existence, its focus was on spreading evil and standing out from accepted society. While these goals do align with the public's perception of Satanism, Euronymous' black metal didn't follow any particular religion or ideology. Satanic symbols were occasionally used, but they were removed from their original context, utilized only as a tool to build black metal's evil image. Many of the band's use of satanic imagery boil down to replicating depictions of Satanism from the fictional media they liked. Varg was the first to introduce black metal's signature brand of Satanism into the genre. His religion perfectly meshed with the black metal subculture for two reasons. The obvious one is the idea of one's alignment with evil, something that was seen as a core tenet of the genre. The more interesting one comes from Varg's use of Satanism as a political ideology. Varg saw significant problems with modern society at the time and aimed to fight it by any means necessary. Just like Satan wages an endless war with God, Varg was a misanthrope who wanted to wage an endless war with humanity. In Norway, the easiest option for this sort of spiritual warfare came in the form of religion. Norway is an overwhelmingly Christian country, with 83% of its populace calling themselves Protestants at the time of black metal's origins. Furthermore, blasphemy was seen as extremely taboo. Horror films were frequently banned or heavily censored in Norway, with even films like Life of Brian being banned due to their blasphemous nature. This provided the perfect setting for Varg's form of terrorism. An extremely Christian country could most effectively be psychologically terrorized through the spread of satanic beliefs. Satanism's juxtaposition with traditional Norwegian society, combined with Satan's biblical status as the ultimate societal adversary, complemented black metal's second tenet, that of fighting accepted values by any means necessary. This leads to the first element of Varg's personality that would lead to him amassing a cult following over the years. Varg has a tendency to attach an ideological basis to anything he is doing, always in the form of adapting a pre-existing religious or political movement to suit his needs. The later stages of Varg's life make it clear that this is an intentional move, and an effective one at that. This addition of ideology elevated a group of musicians to a movement, by giving them a political purpose to unite over. They were no longer just making music or exhibiting extreme behavior on stage. Anything they created or destroyed now served a common goal, that being ideological terrorism of the Norwegian public. The second element of Varg's appeal is the boldness he broadcasts his beliefs with. Even when his actions are deemed reprehensible to the general populace, Varg never hesitates to put them out into the world and promote them through media. During the infancy of black metal, he was already known for this, as he frequently contacted metal magazines throughout Europe to spread misanthropic satanic ideas. All of his interviews portray an extremely bold person who truly believes in what they're saying, even though the rest of society stands against him. A figure like this in a movement serves to inspire. Musicians who were previously aimless were now handed an ideology that suits their genre's tenets, and emboldened to commit to it entirely by a seemingly fearless figurehead. Varg's unashamed belief in his ideology led to people that were only somewhat interested in it adopting it fully. A lot of the musicians who were in the scene at the time now describe it as cult-like, with Varg as the group's leader and the others as followers. After years of reflection, everyone involved describes the period as a haze, being swept up in Varg's art, ideology and melodrama, and losing a sense of reality. Many describe feeling that their anti-establishment actions, promoted to them by Varg, were spiritual in nature. There is no doubt that this was intentional. Varg has a tendency to make anything he is involved in seem grander than it is, tying pre-existing religion and ideology into anything he does. Mortis, a musician who is involved in the scene, has gone on to describe it as a Charles Manson situation. This element only exhibited itself fully once black metal turned violent. When Varg started his wave of church burnings in 1992, it could have easily ended with him. But his extreme personality is what led to others joining in. Varg went out of his way to speak to the media, intentionally intimidating them and pushing threats of a war between black metal and general society. His spread of satanic ideology and calls to violent action started in local media, with his Bergens Tidende interview spreading his views to the rest of Norway. However, his extremity elevated the article beyond a standard interview, with mentions of his previous and future violent crimes, quickly turning him into an international media sensation. In addition to his media appearances, his taunting of the police during his crime spree makes it immediately obvious why a person like Varg is so influential to the discarded youths of 1990s Norway. Any story featuring him and the police has achieved the legendary status, portraying a fearless leader who cannot be stopped in the same way your average criminal can. He used photos of his own arsons in promotional material, outwardly threatened that he's going to burn and kill without ever being charged with any of it. And his dauntless attitude wasn't only relegated to the printed word, as he would frequently waste police time by leading them to believe he was going to confess for days at a time before giving them useless information. One of these stories includes him telling police officers during an interrogation that he was going to lay his cards out on the table the next day. His next interrogation featured him coming back in with a deck of cards, physically laying them out on the interrogation room table, and leaving without saying anything of value. His most notorious interaction with the police came after the church fire group was established to investigate the dozens of arsons committed up until that point. With Varg already holding the position of prime suspect, they were dispatched to Bergen to follow him. Instead of the group getting any useful insight though, Varg managed to invert the situation and track them down to their makeshift headquarters in a local hotel. He knocked on their door, wearing chainmail with 2 large knives in his belt and 2 henchmen by his side, and told the police to stop the investigation immediately. Upon being informed that he isn't in a position to be giving out orders, he took a step back, performed a Roman salute, and left. The theatrical nature of his behavior made him seem less like a real person to the Norwegian public and more like a mythological entity from their own folklore. To some, he was an unstoppable demon spreading hate into the world, and to others, he was a hero standing up for what's right. A large part of this was Varg's Count GRISHNACKH persona. While many black metal musicians have extreme personas that they use in their art, there seemed to be no distinction between Varg and the Count. In the years following, his peers placed a lot of emphasis on this. People like Dead or Euronymous presented themselves as evil and extreme in public, but their personas were lessened or dropped entirely in private. Varg dissolved the boundaries between him and the Count. His behavior was consistent no matter who his audience was. Varg was Count GRISHNACKH and Count GRISHNACKH was Varg. Without a way to differentiate between Varg's natural personality and the character he put on for others, his beliefs were legitimized even further in the eyes of his audience. As there was no baseline to compare Varg's behavior to, nothing he did felt scripted. It felt like the mythical figure of Count GRISHNACKH was who he truly was. Varg's boldness led to his movement spreading outside his immediate circle, outside Norway, even outside Scandinavia. There are countless reports of non-Norwegians torching churches and committing various heinous crimes in the name of Satanism and Varg around this time period. In Kristiansand, on the other side of Norway, black metal Satanists resorted to stabbing Christians on the street in broad daylight. In one occasion, they broke into a midnight mass and attempted to kill the minister in the middle of the sermon. In Sweden, the 18-year-old Suvi Mariotta Purunen set fire to a death metal musician's house in Varg's name, and the investigation into the crime unveiled a diary entirely focused on her obsession and love for Varg Vikernes. The Swedish Black Circle, consisting of the bands Abruptum and Dissection, was responsible for a stabbing and the desecration of over 250 graves. Church arson spread to the country too, most of the time performed by teenagers who explicitly said they did this for Varg. A member of the Swedish Black Circle, called the True Satanist Horde, committed multiple murders and used the skeletal remains in satanic rituals at an altar in his home. In England, the members of a group called Necropolis destroyed various churches and desecrated countless grave sites in the name of Norwegian black metal. Following their arrest, they would go on to quote Varg in interviews and spread similar satanic ideology. Their actions nearly led to black metal being banned in the UK entirely, similarly to the way violent horror films were banned across the country around that time. The US had Deicide, whose frontman Glenn Benton practiced Varg's medieval Satanism, branded an upside-down cross on his forehead, and advocated for animal sacrifices. Various murders and animal sacrifices from the country were linked to fans of Norwegian black metal. The American band, the Electric Hellfire Club, passionately advocated for Varg's burning of churches and even used one of his arson photographs as an album cover. And '96 featured the forming of the National Church Arson Task Force, which happened solely because there were a total of 429 church arsons and bombings in the US within the few years preceding it alone. In Finland, 4 black metal fans went so far as to torture and kill one of their friends in a human sacrifice ritual to Satan. These stories extend to Poland, the Soviet Union, France, Germany. Looking into the underground music scene of the 90s, it's hard to find a country without a single example of Varg-inspired violence. In his home country, Varg had legions of fans following him anytime he was spotted on the street. There are countless reports of fans getting into fights to impress Varg or to defend him against any detractors. He was the black metal messiah. Any evil done within the scene was done in his name. He was seen as the embodiment of evil, which led to great success for him between '91 and '93. However, it came as a great detriment once he was finally arrested in 1993. Varg would later claim that he is a political prisoner above all, and he is not wrong. The Norwegian black metal trials included various people who committed equally heinous crimes, yet none of them received as serious of a punishment as Varg. Faust was engaged in the exact same arson Varg was charged with, and committed an equally gruesome murder of a stranger. Yet, he only received 14 years in prison, while Varg was hit with the maximum sentence allowed within Norwegian law, 21 years. It's hard to look at this and not acknowledge that Varg's media personality affected his sentencing. The police, the judge, the jury, even his lawyers were all people who had become intimately familiar with Varg's antics through the news in the years prior. They had all developed a dislike of him and his persona, which would prevent any of them from being as impartial as a court case of this scale requires. Instead of trying to make the situation better by backtracking on his previous actions, Varg only fanned the flames by giving similarly incendiary interviews to news outlets during his sentencing. By the end of the trial, Varg made every single person deciding his fate hate him and want to punish him to the fullest extent of the law. Varg was made an example of and locked away for the decades to come. But his fighting back in the face of evil only further strengthened the cult of personality that had formed around him during his crime spree. On the day of his sentencing, 2 churches were burnt down in his honor. And this was only the start. His destructive sphere of influence would only keep expanding now that Varg was in a jail cell. During the start of his prison days, Varg's mythological status kept being enhanced by the media. He became known to everyone only under his mysterious black metal alias, the Count. Rumors started spreading about his evil deeds. presenting him as a sadist and a blood-drinking vampire. While Varg was thrilled with his cult status, he wasn't happy with the portrayal it took. The trials that got him imprisoned lacked any concrete evidence for most of the crimes committed. It was based purely on witness testimony. At the time, the black metal scene followed a strict vow of silence. This is what allowed them to engage in crimes for so long without being caught. Even if everyone in the scene was aware of the crimes happening, they refused to speak about them to outsiders. This vow broke down after the arrests, as all of the scene's musicians succumbed to police pressure and confessed in detail about any crimes they were aware of. All of them except Varg. His old friend's testimonies are what got Varg the 21-year prison sentence. This caused Varg to want to distance himself from the black metal scene as much as possible. Since black metal was heavily tied to Satanism precisely due to Varg's previous actions, Varg needed to reject his satanic roots to sever himself from the movement. He adopted another religious philosophy, Norse paganism, or as he refers to it, heathenism. Heathenism functionally served the same purpose to Varg as Satanism. It was another movement in direct opposition to the Norwegian public, as it was displaced by Christianity upon its arrival to Scandinavia. But while heathenism fulfilled the first element of Varg's leadership strategy, that of functioning as an anti-establishment ideology, a complete shift in his beliefs would have reflected poorly on the second. It's hard to see someone as an unrelenting, bold leader if they are willing to so quickly drop the ideology that got you invested in the first place. This is where we can see another Vargism that enables him to retain his cult of followers. Varg will continuously amplify certain aspects of his actions while ignoring others, in order to present himself in a certain light. He will frequently add context or new information that legitimizes his current ideology as the one he has always truly believed in. The first step towards that came in the form of delegitimizing the current media rumors. He was being painted as a satanic Dracula-type figure, something that largely stemmed from his chosen alias. He quickly abandoned Count GRISHNACKH entirely, legally changing his name to Varg Vikernes and going by that exclusively from now on. Varg would then attempt to add another interpretation to his old name by claiming that the Count in Count GRISHNACKH does not come from Dracula, but rather from the word's Latin origin in comtes, companion. He would claim that his alias always alluded to him being the companion of the people. He would also bring emphasis back to the GRISHNACKH half of the name, which was largely ignored by the media's referral to him as just the Count. Varg would refer to Tolkien's Norse mythological influence, claiming that Sauron heavily resembles portrayals of Odin, with his orcs being based on Vikings. He rebranded Burzum by ignoring its original meaning of darkness, stating that Burzum was always meant to stand for the light of Odin. To his credit, Burzum does feature a lot of references to Norse mythology in its early tracks. Varg would attempt to put a spotlight on those, while ignoring overtly satanic tracks on the early albums. After recontextualizing his name and musical work, he would go on to systematically disprove the media's portrayal of his past actions. And this is where his prior theatrical behavior starts to become a problem for him. There are countless interviews of Varg spouting satanic rhetoric and claiming that his crimes were done in the devil's name. These were in the form of printed word and still available, allowing anyone to go back and compare his current statements with his old ones. Varg's rebuttal was simple. All of those articles were misquoting him. This might sound like a stupid and overly simple explanation, but it isn't one that should be discredited easily. Varg's most famous interviews come from the pages of the Bergens Tidende, which made him infamous throughout Norway, and Kerrang, which made his name known worldwide. The Bergens Tidende article was printed while Varg was in custody on suspicion of arson in early 1993, meaning that he was never able to fact-check and approve what was written about him. This article was used as a template for any early articles reporting on the arsons, as none of those reporters had access to the still imprisoned Varg. The biggest contention with that article comes from their reporting that the Fantoft burning occurred on the 6th of June at 6 AM because of its ties to the number of man, 666. Varg now claims that the burning occurred on the 6th of June to honor the anniversary of the first recorded Viking raid. Fantoft was chosen due to being placed on top of an ancient pagan circle used to worship the sun. Varg has gone on to claim that all of the early arsons were done in the name of Odin, as a way of taking back Norse land colonized by Christianity. Any satanic elements in the arsons came about from copycats who saw the crimes branded as satanic in the media. The Kerrang article was not an interview at all, as Varg was in custody at the time of the article's writing. All of the statements attributed to Varg were given to the magazine by Euronymous. They could have been genuine statements Euronymous simply passed down, or completely fabricated. All we know is that Kerrang did not get them from Varg directly as they made it seem. Combine that with the fact that Norwegian media frequently printed unverified rumors and outright lies about the count, and the issue of Varg's true beliefs in the early 90s becomes more complicated. It is impossible to know how many and which of the articles from the era are entirely factual, and how many were deliberately misrepresenting Varg in order to satisfy the public's hunger for anti-satanic news. It is undeniable that the satanic panic of the late 20th century has resulted in countless non-satanic things being branded as satanic, since the Christian public was on a witch hunt to demonize anything that put their way of life at risk. Varg could have simply been one of the victims of that witch hunt. This is the gray area that Varg likes to live in. He provides just enough context to make the new interpretation plausible. His changes and additions are not provable, but they cast a shadow of doubt on the current interpretation. It becomes impossible to concretely prove either interpretation as the correct one. The only resolution to it is branding one side of the argument's word as more trustworthy. This means that very few of those who are already against Varg come over to his side. But those who are on the fence or are already devoted fans can allow themselves to fully embrace his leadership. Varg's cult of personality is only strengthened because of this, keeping old fans by enforcing his facade of boldness while recruiting new fans through the newly acquired ideology. While convoluted, this strategy seems to have worked out for Varg. Many of the black metal bands at the time converted to heathenism following Varg's conversion, with most of them also claiming that they were always secretly heathens. The most interesting example of this is Varg's old band, Old Funeral, which rebranded into Hades in 1993 and adopted similar pagan themes. Varg effectively started another parallel black metal scene from the people that worshipped him, and that scene would slowly end up becoming the dominant one in Norway. Satanic imagery would go on to fade out of Scandinavian black metal, being replaced instead by the aesthetics and themes of Norse mythology. Bands that sang their praises to Satan now did the same for Odin. Despite performing a complete ideological shift to separate himself from the satanic black metal that defined him, Varg succeeded in yet again converting an entire subgenre to his set of beliefs. The media might not have been on his side yet, but anyone in the scene thought of him as a devoted pagan and followed suit. And his methods, as well as the aggressiveness he employs them with, would only become stronger from here on out. Varg's self-mythologizing would escalate in this period. While his mother continued releasing the albums he recorded in '92 and '93, he was unable to make any new music in prison. However, he was allowed a computer, and writing quickly became his new creative outlet. In 94 and 95, he started sending articles to various underground publications around the world. These would be edited and compiled into a book titled Vargsmal, or Varg's Speech. On the surface, Vargsmal was Varg's defense against perceived slander by the media. Its content primarily centered on his anti-establishment political views and his pagan outlook on spirituality. More interestingly, Vargsmal's title and structure was heavily inspired by Havamal, an Old Norse poetic monologue given by Odin on the ethics and behavior people should follow. In his book, Varg equates himself to Odin. Just like Odin justifies his behavior that was considered evil by the rest of the world in Havamal, Vargsmal sees Varg asserting himself as a martyr that did what had to be done for the greater good and suffered the consequences. He presents himself as an unwilling messiah, chosen to lead and suffer. He refers to himself as the chieftain of the people, a title often given to Odin. Similarly, he presents moments from his own life by likening them to various victories and trials suffered by Odin in Norse mythology. Varg was no longer satisfied with being an icon to his own subculture. He wanted to insert himself into an already existing religion. With himself as Odin, their leader and chieftain, he refers to the black metal scene as his Uskarai. Uskarai is a prevalent motif within Norse paganism, referring to a legion of dead souls flying across the sky, led by Odin. It also refers to a real ritual practiced by Norse pagans, which is where the similarities to Norwegian black metal become eerie. The real Uskarai were a smaller, cult-like subsection of Norse pagans. They consisted of young men who would ride out and wreak havoc upon villages, partaking in malicious acts of destruction in the name of vengeance. They saw it as their duty to punish those who don't follow tradition through destruction and arson. They presented themselves as supernatural, adopting pseudonyms, wearing ugly and nightmarish clothing, and painting their faces white with black circles around the eyes. Noise played a major part too, serving as a psychological attack on the villages. The louder their drums, bells, rattles, and whips were, the stronger their magic. And their heathen alarm, or heathen noise, was accompanied by high-pitched screeching. Every single one of these elements was mirrored in the black metal scene of the 90s, from the corpse paint, aliases, and ghoulish appearance, to the style of music played and the crimes the group engaged in. Whether you see it as nature cyclically repeating itself, or the teens subconsciously giving tribute to their ancestral roots, this repeat of history gave credibility to Varg's self-mythologizing. The two groups shared undeniable similarities, something that Varg ran with. Another strange coincidence comes from the choice of pseudonyms each of the core members of the Black Circle adopted. Every single one would come true with time. Dead famously ended up dead. Euronymous, Greek for the Prince of Death, used Dead's death to achieve his leadership status within the black metal scene, before too ending up dead. Faust, just like the legend, sold his freedom and morality for power within the scene through his murder of a stranger. And while Varg means wolf in modern Norwegian, it used to be a term given to outlaws in ancient Scandinavian law. The people branded with the term Varg were seen as the devil, banished for committing exceptionally evil acts. Most often, these included murder, arson, treason, and grave robbery. Varg Vikernes committed all of those during his time in the black metal scene. In addition to that, wolves were used as a powerful symbol in Norse paganism. They stood for selfishness and brute force, as well as for a solitary antagonist, existing outside the traditional social order and spreading what society considers evil. Both of the meanings of Varg's name suit the person he had become perfectly. And all of the scenes, strange similarities to Norse folklore, gave Varg room to insert himself into his people's creed, adding a level of mysticism to his actions that wasn't present before. Varg's computer would be seized before he got a chance to finish Vargsmal, but the book would end up being released in its unfinished state anyway. The groundwork for Varg as a mythical figure was already set, and the book would serve as an announcement for Varg's latest project. From prison, Varg attempted to start a religion. He wasn't allowed to due to his criminal record. He attempted to start a political organization. Yet again, the fact that he was actively a prisoner prevented him from doing so. As a compromise, he started the Norwegian Heathen Front, an organization that was technically neither, but in practice both. It was a tightly knit group dedicated to spreading Varg's propaganda, a replacement for the circle he once led within black metal. It was designed to promote heathenism and nationalism. While the NHF officially denies that Varg is their leader, their original address was Varg's own prison cell, and most of the group's writing and communication come from Varg. Their recruitment strategy was interesting. They didn't go out and infiltrate spaces or harass. Varg's cult of personality was strong enough to attract people to anything put out by him. He already had Burzum fans going on pilgrimages to his burnt churches and posing for photos in his merch at the scene of the crime. His previous actions already led people to the NHF. At that point, his writing would aim to re-educate them. His personal website, burzum.org, was the primary recruitment ground. In one interview, Varg stated that he particularly targeted women, believing that if the organization was composed mostly of women, men would naturally be attracted to it too. Going back to Mortis's comparison of Varg to Charles Manson, this was the exact strategy Manson used for recruiting people into his so-called family. Once the NHF was firmly established, Varg expanded into the Allgermanische Heidnische Front, with branches in Norway, Sweden, Belgium, Denmark, Holland, Iceland, Germany, Russia, Finland, and the United States. It had the same goals as the NHF, only switching its target from an idealized heathen Norway to Europe as a whole. Varg always presented the AHF as a large organization due to their branches in many countries. However, this could be another strategy for obscuring the facts. The AHF was primarily an online organization. It was a loose chain of email correspondents who made themselves appear bigger than they are. The actual number of members is not known and can never be known. It was a clever way of boosting Varg's status as the head of a huge organization. Each of the countries mentioned could have 100,000 AHF members or just one. There was no way for anyone but Varg to confirm which was the case. But despite Varg's attempts at forming another organization and becoming their ODIN, his media presence dropped off. The extent of what he could realistically do in prison was very limited, and his heathen ideology was nowhere near as controversial as the old satanic one. The public was slowly losing interest. To keep them watching and listening, Varg had to continuously push his persona further into the extreme, blurring the lines more and more between his real opinions and the character put on for the media. This would result in his heathen ideology evolving into a deformed, grotesque version of itself, an ideology that lasts to this day. Going into the 2000s, there weren't a lot of ideologies that still evoked a visceral reaction within the general public. Communities and ways of thinking that would have been shunned in the 20th century were now becoming accepted. Even if they still had a few detractors, few could compare to the horror Satanism evoked at the heights of the Satanic Panic. When Varg started experimenting with nationalist ideas in his writing for the AHF, he struck gold. What started out as mere anti-globalism and the hatred for the erasure of his Norse culture evolved into racialist views and eventually worship of Nazi Germany. It was the only way Varg could push his persona any further. He started praising anything related to the Third Reich, which led to his discovery of Vidkun Quisling. Quisling was a Norwegian politician who supported the German side during World War II. His name is synonymous with traitor in Norway, and Quisling ended up being executed at the end of the war. Obviously, Varg admired him greatly. Quisling had his own religious system he referred to as universalism, something that Varg started to adopt. It was a strange combination of various spiritual and philosophical beliefs, including both Christian and pagan ideas. He worshipped nature as the ultimate deity, but combined said worship with science. Varg grew obsessed with Quisling, even claiming that he was a direct descendant of Quisling with zero proof. Because of the shame associated with Quisling's name, all of his actual descendants changed their name following the war. In line with all of his previous contrarianism, Varg would change his name to Quisling, going by Varg Vikernes from now on. The views that he represented went beyond typical modern racism. He even sees Caucasian people with brown eyes as subhuman, and preaches universalism-esque Aryan UFO theories, using ancient Norse texts as proof that the Scandinavian people are pure Atlantean Aryan aliens, while the rest of the world is composed of subhumans and semi-human prototypes. Just like the last time, Varg would add or omit context to his previous actions to prove that this ideology was the one he always truly believed in. He claims that the day the first McDonald's in Norway opened, he went there on his scooter and shot out their windows with a rifle to combat globalism. Similarly, he claims that in '92, during his black metal years, he led what he called the Pure Aryan Environment Patrol, a group that would drive around the city with baseball bats looking for immigrants. They failed to ever find any, so they never exhibited physical violence. He alleges that prior to being a Satanist, he was actually a skinhead. When photographs from the time period showed him with long hair, he claimed that he believed in skinhead ideology, just refused to shave his head. The church burnings, which were initially satanic and then retconned to be a pagan act, are now presented as a battle against non-Scandinavians. Varg currently claims that the motivation behind the choice of targets was the fact that Christian churches acted as sanctuaries for illegal refugees in Norway. There is some evidence of his early Nazi beliefs, such as the previously mentioned incident of him performing a Roman salute to the police officers stalking him, or photographs of his house featuring a flag with a swastika on it. The incident of him calling an Iraqi teacher a monkey has also been used by Varg as compounding evidence, as Varg claims that he realized his superiority over the so-called subhumans during his time in Iraq. Another piece of evidence Varg promotes is his ownership of a World War II German helmet and a German firearm in his youth. This has been proven through photographs. However, Varg also owned a lot more weaponry of non-German origin, as Varg was clearly obsessed with weapons of any kind during this period, and stockpiled any weapons he could get his hands on. As usual, all of the stories Varg relays from his childhood are unprovable. The only person that could back them up is his mother Lena Bure, and she has never done so. On the other hand, would you publicly confirm that you raised a child who harbored Nazi beliefs from as young as 6 years old? Even if the childhood stories are true, it's unlikely that Lena Bore would ever corroborate them, as doing so reflects poorly on her too. But this time, the inconsistencies between his past and present didn't seem to matter. His ideology was so extreme that the people who were a part of the Varg cult were already too far in. You either agreed with everything he was saying, or you were a detractor and an enemy. The mainstream media and the general public were pulled back into his spell, protesting and regularly reporting on his antics. They were all passionately against him, but shining a spotlight on Varg still fulfilled his desire for attention and brought more like-minded Nazis to the AHF. This time period saw Varg writing extensively, publishing racialist, nationalist, and pagan articles, both through the NHF and through various other far-right publications around the globe. He had frequent altercations with Muslim prisoners, which led to Varg regularly being transferred between prisons and put in solitary confinement. One of the incidents escalated into a physical fight, after which both Varg and his opponent had to be hospitalized. But that doesn't even compare to what Varg would attempt in 1997. In 1997, Varg began associating himself with the EINSATZGruppe, a violent neo-Nazi organization closely aligned with Varg's beliefs at the time. Named after the SS action groups tasked with killing civilians, the Norwegian EINSATZGruppe patrolled down the street, beating any immigrants they encountered. Varg first showed support for them in an interview for Norwegian TV2. He shaved his head in preparation for it and appeared on television in a black bomber jacket, sporting a belt buckle with SS insignia. He spouted his now standard Nazi rhetoric and publicly announced that he and EINSATZGruppe were dangerous. Around the same time, he started selling Burzum merch that contained swastikas, SS insignia, as well as referred to Varg as an EINSATZKOMMANDO. All of the merchandise was advertised with skinhead models. The most prominent member of the EINSATZGruppe was the 22-year-old Tom Vikernes, who started the Norwegian chapter of the Ku Klux Klan and was being funded by the American KKK organization. His ultimate goal was waging war against the Zionist-occupied government, which would take the form of race-based guerrilla urban warfare, and his plan was about to be brought into reality. He and 4 other EINSATZGruppe members robbed a Stavanger gun store, in the process stabbing its store clerk. They took rifles with telescopic lenses and silenced firearms, exactly what their urban warfare plans called for. They attempted to flee to Sweden in a stolen car, but were swiftly arrested by Swedish police after refusing to stop at customs. The group was extradited back to Norway, with Tom being placed in the same prison Varg was currently being held at. Unsurprisingly, the two quickly became friends, causing Tom to sever his KKK ties and pledge his allegiance to Varg. To understand the events that took place here, you first need to understand how the Norwegian prison system works. In Norway, prisoners are allowed leave, meaning that, if approved, they are allowed to spend a predetermined amount of time outside the prison as long as they don't leave the agreed upon area. Typically, prisoners are able to be granted leave after serving 4 years of their sentence. Unsurprisingly though, Varg kept being declined leave due to his concerning behavior. Tom, however, was granted leave in 1997 and quickly began working on a plan he had hatched with Varg. The details of it are not entirely clear, as none of the parties involved ever admitted to this plan existing, but here's what is known about Varg's 1997 escape attempt. Tom breached the conditions of his leave, effectively escaping the prison himself. But after looking for Tom for some time, the police eventually tracked him down to a hideout in Hemnes, Norway. They raided the location on the 8th of April 1997, but they found a lot more than Vikernes. Inside were 5 young men, including Tom. In their possession, they had bulletproof vests, steel helmets, cartridge belts, ski masks, dynamite with blasting caps, as well as a large collection of firearms stolen from National Guard depots. In addition to that, they had sketches of the Høystadmoen military camp, with their arms depot marked out, as well as a list of firearms hidden at a separate location. Their plan was clearly to start the war against the government Tom always dreamed of. The group had names, photographs, addresses, and house plans of various prominent Norwegian politicians, bishops, and public figures. There was a map to a hideout in the mountains, presumably the location the group planned to lie low in had their plan been successful. So how does this relate to Varg? Well, part of the plan discovered during the raid included violently breaking Varg out of prison and escaping with him to Africa. And this entire endeavor was funded by none other than Lena Bore, Varg's mother, who gave the group $20,000 out of Burzum's profits to kickstart their preparations for war. Tom was arrested again and transferred to a different prison. Surprisingly, no additional charges were given to any of the parties involved. But this event made Varg's stay in prison significantly worse. The Norwegian secret police started taking notice of Varg's extremist views. Varg almost succeeded in arranging a terrorist attack out of his prison cell. This couldn't happen again. Varg was now kept under close watch, regularly being examined by the secret police as a terrorist risk. Police informants were put into the prison, impersonating Nazis and attempting to befriend Varg in order to get him to disclose any plans that he wouldn't openly reveal to his wardens. Varg's communication to the outside world was cut short, as the prison ended his ability to send out letters for an extended period of time, and Varg would be forced to spend huge chunks of the remainder of his sentence in solitary confinement. His media appearances ceased. During this period of silence, Varg would go back to his roots. It's easy to forget that before the race wars and the murders and the church burnings, Varg was primarily an immensely talented musician. His music is what initially drew people to him, and his black metal work continues to inspire black metal artists to this day. Most respected black metal bands today have a line of influence that can be traced back to Burzum, and his album Philosophim has received critical praise as one of the best albums of all time. His complete dedication to the sound he pioneered was unparalleled by anyone else in the scene. He developed an entirely new musical style by refusing to take in any outside opinion, something that I discuss in more detail in my previous black metal video. While Varg was reviled by the general public, he was still a celebrity. Whether it was because they were fans of his music or because they agree with aspects of his worldview, Varg had prison guards who were willing to bend the rules to make his prison stay easier. In 1997, this exhibited itself in one of the guards sneaking in a synthesizer and a tape recorder for Varg while he was cut off from pretty much everything else. Even though Varg's fame comes from metal, each of his previous albums included a seemingly out-of-place synth track. Something that Varg explains is him playing around with the recording studio synthesizer while the engineer was setting up his musical equipment. Varg would go all in on this now, creating and releasing an entire synth album titled Dodi Baldurs in a week, before his equipment was confiscated again. This process would repeat 2 years later, in 1999, when Varg created and released GRISHNACKH, his second synth album. Just like his black metal work effectively started the subgenre, these two albums were instrumental in creating a new genre known as dungeon synth, with Varg's contributions being created inside an actual dungeon. Dungeon synth has been described as video game music, as it transforms the hypnotic, repetitive riffs of black metal into electronic instrumentals. The genre tends to include high fantasy themes, something that was also true for Varg's work, as both of his dungeon synth albums relate stories from Norse mythology. On a somewhat unrelated note, Varg appeared to have been a fan of video games, unsurprising given his love for board games. One of the funniest incidents of Varg breaking the prison rules comes from the early 2000s, when he had a guard sneak a PC into his cell. He didn't use the PC to write new material or to attempt to make music. He only wanted to play Deus Ex, Morrowind, and Europa Universalis. He got his wish, as a guard let Varg borrow his own copies of the games. It's unclear whether Varg got to finish any of them before prison management found out that he was gaming in his cell. As you might expect, Varg's media silence and return to music didn't do much to deter Varg's cult from following in the footsteps of his '97 escape attempt. His beliefs were already firmly established before the police intervened. Those who still saw him as a proud, confident leader didn't hesitate to follow him into revolutionary action again. In a repeat of his 1991 entrance into the black metal scene and his 1993 transformation of it, the majority of the scene redirected themselves again. They were no longer Satanists or just pagans. They were Nazis, like their figurehead. Swastikas and SS insignia became as prominent in black metal imagery as inverted pentagrams once were. And the lyrics about Odin were replaced by references to the Third Reich and Aryan supremacy. And just like the church burnings that started through his influence in '92, this rebrand was accompanied by a new wave of crimes, much more violent than the earlier arsons. In Linköping, Sweden, a group led by a black metal musician going by Belfagor engaged in what they called a nigger hunt, in which 3 males chased down a black man armed with axes and machetes. Another Varg-inspired Swedish vigilante going by Laserman shot at least 10 immigrants with a scoped rifle. Jon Nordvit, a member of the band Dissection and a personal friend of Varg, was arrested in relation to an incident in which a group assaulted passerbys on the street while shouting "Sieg Heil, shall we slaughter people?" One of the group's members went on to murder a seemingly random Algerian man in Gothenburg soon after. A French black metal circle going by the Sacred Order of the Emerald was involved in grave desecrations and a murder. During one of the raids tied to their previous crimes, the police uncovered a sack with various neo-Nazi publications, including those by Varg, as well as instructions on constructing improvised explosives. Again, these stories can unfortunately be seen repeated throughout most black metal and far-right scenes in the world, with examples of nationalist violence directly tied to Varg existing in Russia, the US and Poland, among others. But Varg's freedoms were about to open up again. The limits his prison imposed on Varg's external communication slowly loosened over the years that followed, as countless meetings with psychiatrists and police experts deemed him to no longer be a terrorist risk. In 2003, after spending 10 years in prison, Varg was approved for leave for the first time. He was allowed to walk around Tonsberg unsupervised for 4 hours. Varg immediately seized this opportunity to borrow a car from a fellow inmate and drive it to a cabin in the mountains, far outside the zone he was allowed in. He managed to lose control of the borrowed car and crash at the mountain, so he decided to steal a passing Volvo driven by a teenage girl and her parents. The father called the police before Varg even left their line of sight. For some reason, he decided to turn around and head towards Oslo, before being spotted by a patrol car soon after. It took a full motorway roadblock to arrest Varg again. At the point of being arrested, Varg had on him a bulletproof vest, a Walther PP pistol, an M67 hand grenade, parts of an MP5 submachine gun, as well as parts of a G3 battle rifle in the cabin. It is still unclear how Varg managed to acquire so much weaponry in such a short amount of time, or who provided the directions to the cabin he intended to hide out in. His attempted escape and all of the crimes he committed during it granted him an additional 13 months in prison. Varg would go on to claim that in the mountains, he encountered a squad of disguised Norwegian Special Forces operatives with assault rifles and German shepherds, who blocked his path with an SUV and attempted to assassinate him. However, there is no evidence of this ever taking place other than Varg's own testimony that it did indeed transpire. It is likely that the government wanted Vikernes gone by this point, and the past has proven that first world governments are not above assassinating political dissidents. The fact that he was able to secure an arsenal of weapons in a hideout without the police or prison staff noticing is highly suspicious. But it is important to remember that Varg has a history of manipulating the truth or outright lying when he sees the lie as being in his favor. In this case, claiming that he was facing an assassination attempt gives him a credible reason for stealing the vehicle, and provides an out if he was to face additional charges. That's not even to mention that the idea of his own government attempting to assassinate him due to his ideology elevates him into the martyr that he clearly wanted to be. Within anti-establishment movements, this fact would bring him a lot of supporters and increase his perceived importance. Varg stood a lot to gain from his scenario being true, both legally and in terms of the persona he tries so hard to maintain. He has already pulled a similar stunt before though. Following the murder that initially got him incarcerated, he would go on to claim that he killed Euronymous in self-defense, in order to get away without legal repercussions or at the very least with a lesser sentence. So while I wouldn't put it past the government to attempt to assassinate the biggest political dissident it's had in decades, the similarities between the two situations and Varg's behavior between them makes me seriously doubt Varg's credibility. Again, Varg would decide to lie low following his second escape attempt, writing occasionally about his prison experiences and Norse paganism, while quietly serving the remainder of his sentence. And on the 22nd of May 2009, after serving almost 16 years of his prison sentence, Varg Vikernes was released on parole. Upon his release from prison, Varg was able to for the first time understand how infamous his name had become throughout Norway. Due to the ideology tied to the name of Varg Vikernes, most businesses refused to associate with him. He struggled with booking plane or train tickets, renting cars, getting hotel rooms, and even opening bank accounts. Releasing more music or writing was out of the question, as no notable record label or publishing house wanted him to represent them. In addition to that, he faced constant issues with impersonators. The cult of followers he developed would regularly attempt to impersonate Varg and do things in his name. That, combined with the social consequences of his name being that of a known neo-Nazi and murderer, severely limited his ability to do anything in Norway. And despite serving his prison time, the consequences of his pre-prison antics would only truly affect him now. In '97, an additional trial was held, during which it was decided that Varg was to pay back $5 million at 12% interest to the government, in order to rebuild the churches he had torched in the early 90s. Now that he was finally out of prison, those payments began. Varg refused to give the government any money, but that in turn meant that any profits he made or any property he owned would be immediately seized to pay for the fine. An interesting element that only becomes relevant here is that Varg Vikernes was married. Shortly before being released from prison, he got married to a French woman by the name of CACHET and had a son with her. He initially had plans to commit to starting a family with her in Norway, but that proved to be impossible. So after a year of serving his parole in Norway, he was able to leave the country again. Varg used that freedom to permanently move to France with his wife in order to avoid the discrimination he was facing and the fines he had no intention of paying. To this day, he hasn't paid a single cent of the $5 million fine he received. Varg also changed his name. Legally, he became Louis CACHET, taking his grandfather's first name and his wife's last name. In his day-to-day life and media presence, he still used the name Varg Vikernes, but officially being known as Louis CACHET let him sign paperwork and make purchases that he previously couldn't due to the weight his old name carried. There was an important change to the world since Varg's incarceration. The internet, which was only in its infancy in the 90s, was in full bloom. Varg no longer needed the media to cooperate in order to spread his rhetoric. He could do it entirely by himself now. He would get a lot of use out of this, as he started a blog and a YouTube channel under the name Thulian Perspectives, dedicated to sharing his ideology. At its peak, his YouTube channel reached 250,000 subscribers. This is when the last and biggest act of violence attributed to Varg occurred. Anders Breivik was a Norwegian neo-Nazi who, on the 22nd of July 2011, performed a terrorist attack that ended up killing 77 and injuring 319 people. Shortly prior to the attack, he personally sent Varg Vikernes his manifesto. In 2013, Varg's wife had purchased 3 rifles and a shotgun within a short amount of time. This, combined with Varg's internet activism and the attribution of the 2011 mass murder to him, prompted the police to raid Vikernes' property. A SWAT team shot out his door and arrested both of them, before questioning them under the charges of conspiring to commit acts of terrorism. Both Varg and Marie were soon cleared and released, as the firearms had been purchased legally and there was no evidence of any planning to commit terrorism. However, Varg would be brought to court again the same year, under the charges of racism, anti-Semitism, and apology of war crimes and crimes against humanity, with the primary evidence being over 900 pages of his recent public posts online. He was deemed a risk to national security, and the courts tried to have him deported back to Norway. They didn't have sufficient legal basis to do so, but that doesn't mean the trial had no consequences to Varg and his family. Varg was evicted from the house he was renting, his bank account was closed, and he was banned from using various services, both online and in person. The name Louis CACHET quickly acquired the same disadvantages he had as Varg. He was ordered to pay an €8,000 fine to the government, as well as 1,500 euros to a Jewish charity. Once the news got out about this, French nationalists quickly raised 16,000 euros for him, but Varg wasn't allowed to use this money for the fines. He was put on probation for 6 months, and was assigned a childcare worker to keep track of him for the following 6 months to ensure that his children are in good care. This appeared to be a wake-up call for Varg. He realized that he didn't have the same protection on the outside that he boasted in prison. In prison, he could say or do anything he wanted to, and the most he would receive was mild disciplinary action from the guards. Out in the free world, his actions almost led him to homelessness, his assets were repeatedly seized, and his children were almost taken from him. Following these arrests, Varg moved one final time to the French countryside. He started living a survivalist lifestyle there, running a mostly self-sufficient farm with his wife and children. He went back to dreaming about societal collapse, an idea that started his journey into weaponry, warfare, and anti-establishment ideologies way back in his childhood. Believing that the societal breakdown has been waiting for over 30 years is inevitable, he lives as a prepper, stockpiling firearms, food, water, and gasoline for the moment the apocalypse eventually hits. He occasionally posted online across various social media websites, but his accounts would quickly be terminated on all of those, either by French authorities or the platform directly. He mostly stopped making music, focusing on writing instead, which includes various books on paganism, as well as a 5-part autobiography titled To Hell and Back Again. He finally created and released his own tabletop RPG, Mifarog, an acronym for Mythic Fantasy Role-Playing Game, which is something he has clearly dreamed of since he was a child. He actually started working on Mifarog way back in his prison days, with the original notes for the rulebook being handwritten during the period between his second escape attempt and his release. While his questionable political leanings never really seeped into his music, traces of them can be found within his RPG. It is a game set in the land of Thule, the ancient origin place of the Aryan race in Nazi mythology. Some of the setting's world-building rules and traditions are based on Himmler-esque esoteric Nazism. However, Varg's days of constant public antics seem to be mostly over. He rarely makes media appearances, and any public posts he makes himself are significantly tamer than anything he would have said back in the day. He still considers himself odalist, which is how he refers to his brand of neo-Nazi paganism. However, he seems to have decided against publicly airing those opinions out into the world, likely due to the fear of further repercussions to himself and his family if he were to continue doing so. And that is where we are now. As of 2024, Varg Vikernes is 51 years old and living in the French countryside with his wife Marie CACHET and their 7 children. He has distanced himself from the art, crimes and provocations of his past, instead spending his time taking care of his farm and his family. But despite his inactivity in recent years, Varg still maintains his cult of influence. His name is still brought up regularly, both in musical and political circles. Those aware of him typically have a strong opinion of him, either worshipping him as a figure not afraid to do what has to be done regardless of the consequences, or seeing him as the devil whose only goal is to tear this world down. Countless acts of violence have been attributed to Varg since his burst into popularity, and I don't doubt that more violence will be dedicated to him in the future. The cult Varg has formed around himself is so strong that it can survive even without him. He has become the mythical figure he always wanted to be, his actions living on as mere stories in our culture's canon rather than something done to and by real people. His persona is no longer a person, but a character taking part in the psychodrama playing out around us and through us. So while the real Christian Vikernes, or Count GRISHNACKH, or Varg Vikernes, or Varg QUISLING, or Louis CACHET lives the rest of his days quietly on his farm, the power that remains behind his symbol as a heathen remains, and will likely remain in our modern mythos long after his living flesh is gone.